On December 12, 1287, 30,000 Mongol warriors embarked on an invasion of Poland under a frigid winter sky. Plumes of vapor billowed from their horses' mouths into the frosty air. These were no ordinary soldiers. They were the direct successors to Genghis Khan's invincible military machine. The same force that had subjugated territories spanning from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna. They had crushed the formidable armies of China, reduced the grand cities of Persia to ash, and brought the Russian principalities to their knees. Twice before, they had laid waste to Poland so thoroughly that entire generations grew up viewing the Mongol hordes as nothing short of the horsemen of the apocalypse. The invasion's commanders, Khan Talabuga and Nagai Khan, had every reason to be confident. Poland had previously proven to be an easy conquest for them. Why would this time be any different? Yet, as their vast army split into two columns and pressed deeper into Polish territory, neither leader could foresee what awaited them. None of them anticipated that this invasion would conclude not in triumph, but in something the Mongol Empire rarely experienced: a decisive and undeniable defeat, one that would echo through the annals of history and ensure that Mongol armies would never again dare to invade Poland. This narrative recounts how a nation learned from its darkest hour, transforming weaknesses into strengths and halting what everyone believed was an unstoppable force. To comprehend the astonishing nature of Poland's victory, one must first grasp the terrifying efficiency of the Mongol war machine. By the 13th century, the Mongols had perfected warfare to a degree unmatched until the modern era. Their army was not merely numerous, it was swift, meticulously coordinated, and brutally effective in ways that medieval Europe had never encountered. At the core of Mongol strength was their cavalry. Every Mongol warrior was, in essence, born in the saddle, learning to ride before they could even properly walk. These were not the heavily armored knights of Europe, who charged in straight lines relying on sheer mass. Mongol horsemen were light, agile, and lethally accurate. With their composite bows, they could fire precisely while galloping at full speed, raining arrows upon foes from distances that European soldiers could not reach. Even more formidable was their mastery of the feigned retreat, a tactical maneuver that annihilated countless armies, convinced they were winning. Here's how it worked, and it was deceptively simple. Mongol forces would engage an adversary, fight briefly, then suddenly appear to flee. The opposing army, believing victory was theirs, would break formation and pursue, attempting to finish off the retreating riders. That's when the trap would spring. Hidden Mongol units would emerge from the flanks. The supposedly retreating soldiers would turn, and the pursuing enemy would find themselves encircled and wiped out. This tactic had worked against the Poles at the Battle of Legnica in 1241. It had worked against the Hungarians. It had worked against almost everyone who fell for it. The Mongols also possessed something that gave them an almost supernatural advantage: intelligence networks and reconnaissance decades ahead of their time. They didn't simply blunder into territories. They sent scouts ahead, sometimes years in advance, gathering information on terrain, resources, political divisions, and military capabilities. By the time a Mongol army arrived at your doorstep, they often knew more about your kingdom than you did yourself. When Talabuga and Nagai planned their invasion of Poland in November 1287, they leveraged all these advantages. Talabuga was to lead 20,000 warriors, including Rus vassals, towards Sandomierz and northern Lesser Poland. Nagai would command 10,000 elite Mongol and Turkic cavalry towards Krakow and its surrounding region. The plan was brutally elegant: strike with overwhelming speed, prevent the Poles from organizing a unified defense, plunder everything of value, and withdraw before winter made military operations impossible. After ravaging their assigned territories and capturing Sandomierz, the two columns were to converge north of Krakow, coordinate their assault on the Polish capital, then retreat to Rus laden with treasures and slaves. The Mongols had done this before, twice, and both times Poland had been powerless to stop them. The trauma of Mongol invasions was deeply etched into Polish memory. If you were a Pole living in 1287, the Mongol terror wasn't ancient history. It was a vivid memory. A horror whispered by grandparents, while children listened with wide eyes. The first invasion in 1241 had been unfathomably catastrophic. The Mongols swept through Poland like a plague, moving so rapidly that the fragmented Polish principalities could not coordinate any meaningful resistance. City after city fell. In the Battle of Tursko, Polish knights, lured into pursuit, broke formation and were annihilated. At Chmelnik, another Polish force suffered defeat. This was followed by the destruction of Krakow itself, Poland's jewel and its cultural and economic heart. The timber defenses guarding the city proved to be as fragile as paper. The Mongols burned Krakow to the ground and pressed on, leaving nothing but ash and corpses in their wake. Then, on April 9, 1241, the Battle of Legnica occurred. Prince Henry II the Pious, one of Poland's most powerful rulers, assembled what appeared to be a formidable army. He gathered his knights, reinforcements from Greater Poland, troops from Opole, and even Templar contingents sent by the Pope himself. This should have been enough, but it proved insufficient. The Mongols employed their standard tactics: feigned retreats, smokescreens to conceal their movements, and flanking maneuvers that enveloped the Polish cavalry and cut them off from infantry support. The Polish chronicler Jan Długosz later alleged that the Mongols even shouted, "Run, Polish!" through the smokescreen to sow panic. Whether true or not, the outcome was undeniable: complete annihilation. Henry II died on the battlefield. His body was so severely mutilated that his widow could identify him only by his toes. He had 6 toes on his left foot. The Mongols impaled his head on a spear and displayed it before the defenders of nearby towns, attempting to break their will. The message was clear: resistance was futile. The 1259 invasion unfolded according to the same brutal script. Polish cities blazed again, and wooden fortifications once more proved powerless against Mongol siege tactics and overwhelming numbers. Sandomierz, Krakow, Lublin, Zawichost, Bytom, all were plundered for a second time in less than 20 years. The psychological impact was immense. An entire generation of Poles grew up believing that upon the approach of the Mongols, one could only pray for mercy or flee. Therefore, when scouts brought news of Mongol armies gathering on the eastern border in late 1287, the terror was immediate and piercing. They were coming again. The nightmare was returning. How many more cities would burn? How many more children would be enslaved? How many more knights would die in vain, attempting to halt an unstoppable foe? Yet, something had shifted. Something the Mongols were unaware of and would remain ignorant of until it was too late. After the devastation of 1241, after burying the dead and rebuilding the ruins, Polish leaders confronted a harsh truth. Their existing defenses were suicidal. The wooden palisades and earthen fortifications that had protected Polish settlements for generations were entirely inadequate against a modern, mobile, siege-equipped army like the Mongol Horde. Radical change was necessary, otherwise the next invasion, and everyone knew it would come, would prove equally disastrous. And so, Poland began to reconstruct from scratch, with stone at the core of this transformation. The decision to construct primary fortifications from stone rather than wood was costly, labor-intensive, and absolutely essential. For decades after 1241, the Polish nobility and clergy poured resources into transforming their most vital strongholds into true citadels. Krakow underwent the most profound changes. The capital's old wooden fortress was entirely superseded by a fully stone-built castle, not partially stone with wooden elements, but entirely stone. The walls were thick enough to withstand ramming and siege engines. Towers were strategically positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. These were military installations designed with one purpose: to hold out long enough for aid to arrive. Because Polish military strategists had grasped a crucial insight: the greatest strength of the Mongol army was also its greatest weakness. The Mongols excelled at mobile warfare and rapid raids. They could circle slower European armies, shower them with arrows, and leverage the terrain to their advantage in open combat. However, protracted sieges were a different matter. Sieges were lengthy, expensive, and demanded the diversion of considerable forces. They granted defenders time to call for reinforcements, negated the Mongols' mobility advantage, and compelled them into a grueling war of attrition where numerical superiority played a lesser role than the strength of the fortifications. Prince Leszek II the Black understood this perfectly when reports of gathering Mongol armies reached him in late 1287. He did not succumb to panic. He did not attempt to engage them in a pitched battle in the open field, where the Mongols could exploit their superior mobility to annihilate his troops. Instead, he implemented a deceptively simple, yet brilliantly effective three-phase defensive strategy. Phase 1. Concentrating forces within fortified towns and castles. Instead, Leszek planned a deceptively simple, yet brilliantly effective three-phase defensive strategy. The first phase involved consolidating forces within fortified towns and castles. Leszek's approach was to allow the Mongols to advance, forcing them to expend time and manpower in attempts to breach impregnable walls. The second phase focused on deploying local militias to launch continuous assaults on any small Mongol detachments that dispersed for raiding, making it perilous for the invaders to spread out their forces. The third phase involved launching a concentrated counteroffensive with Polish and Allied troops once the Mongols were depleted, demoralized, and stretched thin. Leszek commanded approximately 15,000 soldiers. While insufficient to defeat 30,000 Mongols in an open battle, this force was ample for executing his defensive strategy, assuming all went as planned. He positioned his main forces to block Talabuga's northern Mongol column, while maintaining strong garrisons in Sandomierz, Krakow, and other vital strongholds. Then, he waited. The Mongols approached, but this time, Poland was prepared. On December 7, 1287, Talabuga's northern column departed its camp near Volodymyr and invaded Poland. 20,000 warriors, including contingents of Rusin vassals under Mongol command, moved with the terrifying efficiency that had made them the scourge of Europe. They bypassed Lublin. There was no point in wasting time on a siege when easier prey awaited, so they proceeded towards Sandomierz. The pace of the Mongol advance was horrifying. Villages in their path simply ceased to exist. Farms were plundered and burned. All who failed to escape were either slain or enslaved. Panic spread faster than the army itself. Refugees streamed into fortified cities, bringing wild tales of the approaching horde. Across Poland, people braced themselves for the worst. The nightmare was recurring, but as Talabuga's forces reached Sandomierz and prepared to seize the city, something unexpected occurred. The Mongols launched their assault, confident the city would fall, just as it had in 1241 and 1259. The defenders were expected to be crushed. The walls were supposed to be breached or burned. But this did not happen. Sandomierz held firm. Modernized stone fortifications, specifically constructed to counter Mongol tactics, proved their worth. Mongol arrows had little impact against defenders sheltered by stone battlements. Siege engines pounded walls that refused to crumble. Assault after assault broke against the city's defenses. For the first time in their Polish campaigns, the Mongols found themselves in a stalemate. This marked the initial crack in Mongol confidence, the first indication that this invasion might not unfold according to their usual script. Talabuga, frustrated yet pragmatic, decided to alter his strategy. If Sandomierz would not fall quickly, they would move on to easier targets. The army diverted its course towards the Świętokrzyskie Mountains, aiming for the wealthy abbey in Wączok. Along the way, they encountered local Polish units that engaged in skirmishes rather than decisive battles. These attacks were constant and vexing, like wolves gnawing at a bear. Then came December 20th, 1287, near a place called Wączok, and everything changed. Prince Leszek II had been closely tracking Talabuga's movements, awaiting the opportune moment to strike. The main strength of the Mongol column was diminished as detachments had fanned out to pillage the countryside. A standard Mongol tactic, yet one that reduced their overall might. In the Świętokrzyskie Mountains, where the terrain hindered Mongol cavalry tactics, Leszek recognized his window of opportunity. The Polish forces that intercepted Talabuga at Wączok were substantial. Contemporary sources do not provide exact figures, but they were sufficient to engage the Mongols in a serious fight. Crucially, These were not the same demoralized defenders who had faced the Mongols in 1241. These were soldiers trained for this very moment, instilled with the belief that Mongol tactics could be overcome, and who stood behind leaders confident in the possibility of victory. When the two armies clashed, the Mongols anticipated their usual dominance. They expected Polish knights to charge recklessly and break formation. They expected to deploy their feigned retreats and flanking maneuvers and watch the enemy descend into chaos. But it did not happen. The Polish forces held their ground. They expertly used the terrain to their advantage, limiting the Mongols' ability to maneuver. When the Mongol cavalry attempted to outflank them, they found themselves in deadly zones where Polish crossbowmen and armored knights could effectively engage them. The battle morphed into a grueling, brutal confrontation. This was precisely the outcome the Mongols sought to avoid. Heavy cavalry, properly positioned and supported, could contend with horse archers. Stone-like defensive formations withstood arrow barrages that would have shattered wooden shields and demoralized troops. The fight lasted far longer than any previous engagements the Mongols had in Poland. And as the hours passed, something unprecedented occurred. The Mongol forces wavered. Talabuga's troops, suffering escalating casualties and failing to secure the swift victory they anticipated, began to fall back. This retreat quickly escalated into a full-blown rout. Polish chronicles vividly described the defeat as exceptionally severe, a mild expression in medieval times for sheer catastrophe. Talabuga's column arduously withdrew from Wa, having lost a significant number of soldiers and, more critically, their aura of invincibility. The army, initially intended to plunder northern Poland with impunity, instead found themselves retreating toward Kielce, and ultimately returned entirely to their winter encampment in Lwów by January 1288. Consider this for a moment. The Mongols, conquerors of half the known world, who had crushed armies far larger than those of Poland and instilled fear in empires, were decisively defeated in open battle by Polish forces and compelled to retreat. This marked the first instance in the annals of Mongol-Polish interactions where the invaders were put to flight. However, the narrative did not conclude there. While Talabuga painstakingly retreated eastward, Nogai's southern column was advancing on Krakow, oblivious to the harrowing ordeal their northern counterparts had just endured. On Christmas Eve, December 24, 1287, Khan Nogai's 10,000 warriors arrived at Krakow. This was slated to be the zenith of the invasion, the moment when Poland's capital would fall for the third time, allowing the Mongols to declare absolute triumph. Nogai had ample justification for his confidence. His forces were fresh, seasoned, and composed exclusively of elite Mongol and Turkic cavalry, with no auxiliary Rumelian troops of questionable loyalty. Besides, they had already seized Krakow on 2 previous occasions. The strategy was straightforward: encircle the city, breach its defenses, overpower the garrison, and then spend a few days looting before withdrawing with plunder and captives. Yet, as Nogai's troops positioned themselves around Krakow's walls, they encountered a sight that must have given them pause. These were not the wooden palisades of 1241, nor even the modest earthworks of 1259. Krakow had been transformed into a formidable fortress. The castle was entirely stone-built, with exceptionally thick and high walls. Along these fortifications, numerous catapults and crossbows were strategically positioned, all aimed outwards. The Mongols commenced their assault. Waves of mounted archers approached the walls, launching barrages of arrows intended to suppress the defenders and provide cover for assault teams. Instead, they were met with a hail of crossbow bolts, whose superior range allowed them to strike before the archers could get close enough to be effective. Catapults hurled stones that decimated Mongol formations, killing horses and scattering troops. As assault parties attempted to scale the walls with ladders and siege equipment, they entered a kill zone where projectiles rained down from all directions. The assault failed. They tried again, repeatedly, but to no avail. The siege of Krakow devolved into a grueling stalemate, one the Mongols could ill afford. Each day spent encamped before these stone walls meant another day of their army consuming dwindling supplies. It meant another day for Polish reinforcements to gather, and another day shortening their campaign window. Raids were meant to be swift: enter, plunder, exit. This siege was becoming everything the Mongols sought to avoid. Contemporary accounts indicate that the Mongols incurred heavy losses and sacrificed several of their commanders in their attempts to capture Krakow. Reread that sentence. The Mongols, who had conquered cities from Beijing to Baghdad, were unable to take Krakow. The capital, which had previously been razed twice, now stood impregnable, its stone ramparts mocking every assault. It is here that we encounter one of history's great legends. While historians debate its precise veracity, the tale is too compelling to omit. According to tradition, a group of Polish raftsmen from the village of Zerksin, hardy laborers who transported goods along the Vistula River, discovered the Mongol encampment outside Krakow's walls. These raftsmen, known as wows, resolved that they would not merely hide and hope for salvation. They executed a daring nighttime raid on the Mongol camp and, legend has it, killed several Mongol generals, including the commander of the siege operations. Is this true? Perhaps, perhaps not. Medieval chronicles often embellished victories and fabricated heroic stories. But here is what we know with certainty. Something went terribly wrong for the Mongols at Krakow. Their siege was unsuccessful. Having suffered unexpectedly severe casualties, Nagai made a decision that any Mongol commander would have preferred to avoid. He lifted the siege, splintered his forces into smaller raiding parties, and endeavored to salvage the campaign by plundering the areas surrounding Krakow to the north and south. The psychological ramifications of this turn of events are difficult to overstate. Krakow, twice before an easy target, had transformed into an unassailable stronghold that the Mongols could not subdue. The city, which had symbolized Poland's vulnerability, became the embodiment of its resilience. If you find this account of medieval military strategy and pivotal historical events engaging, please consider liking and subscribing for more in-depth explorations of battles that altered the course of history. I assure you, numerous compelling narratives await. While Nagai Khan's forces were dispersed across southern Poland, attempting to salvage something from their unsuccessful siege, Prince Leszek II embarked on a calculated gamble. After defeating Talabuga's column near Wagad, he swiftly moved his army southward to Krakow to defend the capital, though not single-handedly. Envoys were dispatched to Hungary, seeking aid from Polish allies. Hungarian voivode Georg Baka responded, leading his seasoned cavalry north to join the fight. This alliance proved critical. The Hungarians shared a difficult history with the Mongols. The 1241 invasion had devastated their population, causing 20 to 40% casualties. Like Poland, Hungary learned harsh lessons from this catastrophe and consequently fortified its defenses. The combined might of Hungarian heavy cavalry and Polish forces formed a formidable joint army. In January 1288, a Mongol detachment of approximately 1,000 warriors found themselves encircled at Stary Sach in southern Poland. This was one of Nagai's raiding parties, separated from the main contingent, focused on maximizing plunder before the campaign concluded. They were likely unaware of Talabuga's defeat and retreat. More critically, they probably didn't know that a Polish-Hungarian relief army was rapidly approaching their position. The Allied forces, commanded by Leszek and Georg Baka, arrived at Stary Sach and inflicted upon the Mongols the very fate the Mongols had often dealt to others: complete surprise. The Mongol unit, confident of no significant hostile presence nearby, was suddenly assaulted by a far superior Allied army. They had no time to organize defenses, execute clever tactical maneuvers, or even conduct an orderly withdrawal. The Battle of Stary Sach devolved into a massacre. The entire Mongol detachment was wiped out, and their commanders slain. Contemporary sources emphasize that the Mongol army was utterly caught off guard, and the Polish-Hungarian forces annihilated them. This was no tactical retreat or strategic redeployment. It was the total destruction of a Mongol unit. When news from Stary Sach reached Nagai, the grim reality became undeniable. Talabuga's column had been defeated and had withdrawn. His own siege of Krakow, the city in Poland known for its historic old town and Wawel Castle, the name is consistent across Polish and English sources, had failed catastrophically. His raiding parties were being harassed by local forces. A substantial Polish-Hungarian army was now in the field, and far from being scattered and demoralized, the Polish defenders were organized, aggressive, and victorious. The campaign had turned disastrous. Nogai made the only sensible decision, a full retreat. In late January 1288, he gathered the remnants of his forces and withdrew to Rus. Unlike previous invasions, he was not leading a victorious army laden with treasures and slaves. He was leading a broken army that had failed to achieve any of its strategic objectives. Mongol sources are remarkably scarce regarding this campaign. Conquests and glory lent themselves well to narratives, but humiliating defeats were quietly forgotten. And here's the striking point. After Stary Sats, after the failed campaign of 1287 to 1288, the Mongols never again invaded Poland. Not once. A nation that had been an easy target for half a century suddenly became territory the Golden Horde wanted nothing to do with. So, what happened? How did the Mongol war machine, which had conquered territories from the Pacific to the Danube, suffer such a resounding defeat at the hands of Poland? Polish historian Stefan Kurowski identified two primary reasons, both revealing crucial lessons about military power. Firstly, internal divisions undermined the Mongol campaign. Talabuga and Nogai were ambitious commanders and coordinated poorly. Their rivalry meant that the two columns operated essentially independently rather than as a unified force. When Talabuga was defeated near Wagad and retreated, Nogai didn't even learn of it immediately. By the time Nogai was besieging Krakow, his northern support had already vanished. Despite their total strength of 30,000 warriors, the army invading Poland could have successfully overwhelmed Polish defenses if it had acted as a cohesive unit. However, split into separate, poorly communicating detachments, they became vulnerable to piecemeal defeat. Union of command was critical, and its fatal absence was a key reason for the Mongols' failure in this campaign. Secondly, and this was a pivotal factor, improved Polish fortifications completely negated the Mongols' main advantages. The very stone castles, meticulously constructed over decades, proved their worth with every coin and every labor-filled moment invested. While the Mongols excelled in mobile warfare, their prowess waned significantly when confronted with prolonged sieges of well-fortified strongholds. Their typical approach, involving rapid movements, psychological warfare, and feigned retreats, held no sway against robust stone walls defended by crossbowmen and siege engines. Each day spent encamped before Sandomierz or Krakow represented a day devoid of plunder, depleting their provisions and allowing Polish forces to coordinate their defenses. This outcome starkly contrasts with the initial invasion of 1241. At that time, the Mongols also dispersed their army into smaller raiding parties, which proved inconsequential as they effortlessly captured poorly defended settlements. They decisively crushed Polish forces near Sandomierz, Legnica, and Chmielnik almost concurrently in February 1241, subsequently seizing Krakow in March without protracted sieges. However, in 1287, the identical strategy resulted in a stalemate, significant losses, and ultimately, a retreat. The three-phase Polish defensive strategy unfolded precisely as planned. Phase 1 involved garrisons staunchly holding fortified positions, refusing to surrender under duress. This denied the Mongols the swift victories they sought. Phase 2 saw local forces harassing Mongol units, making excessive dispersal perilous for them. Constant skirmishes eroded Mongol morale and strength. Phase 3 culminated in a decisive counterattack by a combined Polish-Hungarian army, first against Talabuga near Kopitkov, and then against Nogai's detachment near Stary Sats. Yet, what is truly remarkable about this campaign, and something worth contemplating, is that Poland triumphed not through some brilliant tactical innovation, nor by possessing superior numbers or cavalry compared to the Mongols. Poland emerged victorious because it had learned from its past defeats. They meticulously analyzed the failures of 1241 and 1259, identified their critical vulnerabilities, and dedicated decades to systematically addressing them. Wooden strongholds, which had burned in 1241, were replaced with stone fortresses. The costly recklessness of knights who attacked and perished at Legnica instilled a new understanding of defensive discipline. The fragmented command structure that previously allowed the Mongols to defeat Polish forces piecemeal was centralized under Prince Leszek II. This represents a lesson frequently overlooked in military history. Victory does not always go to those with the most resources or the most formidable warriors. Instead, it often favors those who adapt and learn more swiftly. Poland learned. The Mongols did not. When Nogai's army limped back to Rus in January 1288, a profound shift occurred in the European consciousness. The Mongols, once perceived as an insurmountable force of nature, had been decisively halted. This was achieved not by a massive coalition of kingdoms or a stroke of luck that decimated their army, but by Poland, a nation they had twice devastated before. The psychological impact resonated across Europe. If Poland could defeat the Mongols through proper preparation and defensive strategy, perhaps the Mongol threat wasn't as apocalyptic as feared. Perhaps these conquerors had limits. Perhaps they could be contained. The Mongols themselves evidently absorbed this lesson. After 1288, they never again launched a major invasion of Poland. They found easier targets elsewhere. Why batter their heads against stone fortresses when less prepared territories offered easier plunder? The cost-benefit analysis of invading Poland had fundamentally altered. What was once a readily accessible source of loot and captives became a costly military endeavor with no guarantee of success. Consequently, they simply ceased attempts. Within Poland, this victory catalyzed political transformations that had been brewing for decades. The Mongol invasions had exposed the fatal weakness of Poland's fragmented political structure, characterized by numerous dukes governing separate territories without unified command. The 1287 to 1288 campaign demonstrated the achievements possible when Polish forces coordinated under singular strategic leadership. The momentum for reunification, slowly building since the mid-13th century catastrophes, intensified. In 1320, Władysław I Łokietek was crowned King of Poland, re-establishing the kingdom as a unified monarchy for the first time in generations. The Mongol threat thus helped forge a Polish national identity and, ultimately, a cultural legacy that endures to this day. Back then, the Mongols also split their army into smaller raiding parties, but this barely mattered as they effortlessly seized poorly fortified settlements. They nearly simultaneously routed Polish forces in February 1241 at Sandomierz, Khmelnyk, and Tursko, proceeding to capture Krakow in March without lengthy sieges. Yet, in 1287, this very strategy led to a stalemate, losses, and an enforced withdrawal. The three-phase Polish defense proved flawlessly effective. Initially, garrisons held their fortified positions, refusing intimidation or surrender. The Mongols couldn't achieve their coveted rapid victories. Secondly, local units consistently harassed the Mongol contingents, making extensive dispersal risky for them. The incessant skirmishes eroded Mongol morale and combat readiness. Thirdly, a combined Polish-Hungarian army launched a decisive counterattack. First at Wislice against Talabuga, then at Stary Sox against Nogai's detachment. However, what's truly remarkable and worth contemplating about this campaign is that Poland triumphed not through some ingenious tactical innovation or superior numbers of troops or cavalry compared to the Mongols. Poland prevailed because it learned from its defeats. The Poles meticulously analyzed the errors of 1241 and 1259, identified their critical vulnerabilities, and systematically addressed them over decades. The wooden citadel that burned in 1241 was replaced with stone. The reckless knights who fell at Legnica taught them defensive discipline. The lack of unified command, which allowed the Mongols to defeat Polish forces individually, was rectified through centralization under Prince Leszek II. This, I believe, is a lesson often overlooked in military history. Sometimes, victory belongs not to the wealthiest or most powerful army, but to the one that learns fastest. Poland learned. The Mongols did not. When Nogai's army arduously returned to Rus in January 1288, a profound shift occurred in the European consciousness. The Mongols, previously appearing as an unstoppable force of nature, had been completely halted. And this didn't happen due to a vast coalition of kingdoms or some random disaster annihilating their armies. Poland stopped them, a nation they had already devastated twice. The psychological impact of this event rippled across Europe. If Poland, with adequate preparation and a defensive strategy, could overcome the Mongols, perhaps the Mongol threat wasn't as apocalyptic as everyone feared. Perhaps these conquerors had limits. Perhaps they could be contained. The Mongols themselves undoubtedly absorbed this lesson. After 1288, they never again launched major invasions into Poland. They had easier targets elsewhere. Why stubbornly assault stone fortresses when less prepared territories awaited plunder? The cost-benefit analysis of invading Poland dramatically changed. What was once an easy source of plunder and slaves transformed into a costly military operation with no guaranteed success. So, they simply ceased trying. Within Poland, the victory catalyzed political changes that had been brewing for decades. The Mongol incursions exposed the fatal weakness of Poland's fragmented political structure. Numerous princes governing separate territories, lacking unified command. The 1287 to 1288 campaign demonstrated what could be achieved when Polish forces acted in concert under a single strategic leadership. The momentum for reunification, slowly gaining traction after the mid-13th century catastrophes, significantly accelerated. In 1320, Vladislav I Łokietek was crowned King of Poland, restoring the kingdom as a unified monarchy for the first time in generations. The Mongol threat contributed to the formation of Polish national identity. Furthermore, a cultural legacy endures to this day. The Lichonik tradition, a vibrant parade held annually in Krakow on the first Thursday after Corpus Christi, preserves the memory of these events. A man in elaborate Eastern attire gallantly rides a hobby horse through the streets. Musicians and revelers follow, reenacting the legend of the raftmen who routed a Mongol camp near Krakow's walls. Whether this story is historically accurate or not is almost irrelevant in this context. What matters is what it symbolizes: the transformation of terror into triumph, the refusal to be victims, the obstinate conviction that Poland cannot be conquered. It has always struck me how cultures memorialize their triumphs versus their failures. The Mongols, who meticulously documented their conquests, barely mentioned the 1287 to 1288 Polish campaign in their chronicles. It was a disgrace, a failed raid best forgotten. But Poland remembers, Poland celebrates. Even after 700 years, throngs of people still line the streets of Krakow to witness the lodge's procession and commemorate the era when their ancestors halted the seemingly unstoppable. This exemplifies the power of defensive triumphs in history, as they evolve into foundational legends, critical junctures where a nation validates its capacity to endure. Thus, we return to our central inquiry. What caught the Mongols off guard during their 1287 invasion of Poland? They hadn't anticipated formidable stone fortresses where only wooden palisades once stood. They didn't foresee garrisons holding their ground steadfastly instead of capitulating or fleeing. They were unprepared for local forces aggressively harassing their units rather than cowering in fear. A Polish prince, astute enough to counter their tactics, was also an unexpected adversary. The timely arrival of Hungarian allies at a crucial moment was similarly unanticipated. They certainly didn't expect defeat in open battle at Łopienik, nor their complete eradication near Stary Sots. Most significantly, they hadn't expected a nation that had internalized lessons from its previous defeats. The Mongols envisioned a repeat of 1241 and 1259, an effortless conquest, scattered resistance, and a swift victory. Instead, they encountered a Poland transformed by trauma into something more resilient, something indomitable. They discovered a nation that, for 46 years, had been preparing for their return, constructing defenses specifically designed to neutralize Mongol advantages, training soldiers in tactics effective against horse archers, and developing strategies that converted Mongol strengths into weaknesses. The irony is almost poetic. The Mongols themselves taught Poland how to be strong by revealing their own vulnerabilities. Every wooden wall burned in 1241 had been rebuilt as a stone wall by 1287. Every undisciplined charge that culminated in the slaughter at Legnica imparted a lesson in defensive discipline, a lesson that paid dividends at the battle near Lopienic. Every city that fell easily due to isolation and lack of support led to the alliance with Hungary, which proved decisive near Stary Sots. In 1241, Poland burned. In 1288, the Mongols learned to fear Polish stone. This situation offers a broader lesson that extends beyond medieval warfare. I wish to conclude with this thought. Adaptation is survival. The mightiest army, the most successful empire, the most devastating military force. None of these truly matter if you cannot adapt when circumstances shift. The Mongols conquered half the world, employing tactics that worked brilliantly against unprepared adversaries. However, when confronted by an enemy who had studied these tactics, learned from prior defeats, and systematically built defenses to counter them, their seemingly invincible war machine faltered. Poland in 1287 may have been weaker than Poland in 1241 in terms of raw military power. They didn't possess more soldiers nor superior weaponry. What they did possess was knowledge, dearly bought with blood and tears, and the wisdom to apply that knowledge, which made all the difference. Now, I'd like to hear from you. What other historical instances can you recall where a nation or army rallied from a crushing defeat to triumph against the very same foe? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this story as compelling as I did during my research, please share this video with anyone who appreciates military history. Hit subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into battles that altered the course of history. Remember, even the seemingly unstoppable can be halted. Sometimes, all it takes is refusing to repeat the same error twice.